failed. The fingerprints from the one that didn't go off.
And the Germans can't match it?
No, nobody's got it. We checked out every database we could access, but we're hooked into Langley now.
Run it.
Okay.
And cash gone, no Nesky files. And all very public. This is still a clandestine agency, no?
I don't view this event as a failure.
You call it a success?
We have a lead.
What are we looking at?
I want to know about it.
Know about it? It was a kill squad, black on black. We closed it down 2 years ago. Nobody wants to know about Treadstone, not around here. So I think you better take this back to Marty and let him know.
At the time of his death, he was sitting on a personal account in the amount of $760,000.
You know what his budget was? We were throwing money at him, throwing it at him and asking him to keep it dark.
It was his own account. He was up to something.
This is...
I just have a few questions for you.
Which means you're going to call me back at 30. And when I ask you where we stand, I had better be impressed.
We're all in?
I already have a team in place there. I doubt that Bourne's in
You're on that? You're on that? Health meaning what?
Their mental health. Because of what they had been through, they were prone to a variety of problems.
What kind of problems?
Depression, anger, compulsive behaviors. They had physical symptoms.
Langley pulled an image out of Naples. It's uploading right now.
It's coming in now. Working.
Jason Bourne begins this film with a name, a partner, and a fragile routine, yet none of those things give him a stable identity. He can remember enough to fear what he was, but not enough to understand why the past still seems able to find him. That tension gives the Bourne Supremacy its real starting point. The danger is not simply that Bourne may be attacked again. It is that every new threat forces him to use the instincts he is trying to leave behind. This is cinema deep view, and here the film's central question is more personal than its pursuit across borders. When Bourne is pushed back into the world that made him, can he search for truth without becoming the weapon that world designed? The sequel wastes little energy rebuilding the fantasy of escape. Bourne and Marie have found distance, but not peace. His memories arrive as broken impressions rather than useful answers, and his body reacts faster than his conscious mind. Even in quiet moments, the film suggests that safety is temporary because Bourne carries the machinery of danger inside himself. He does not need a mission briefing to become alert. A change in rhythm, a face that appears out of place, or a vehicle moving with purpose can pull him instantly back into survival. That is what separates this story from a simple chase. The pursuit matters, but the deeper pressure comes from the gap between Bourne's intentions and his abilities. He wants an ordinary life, yet he remains exceptionally skilled at reading threats, escaping traps, and controlling a confrontation. Those abilities protect him, but they also keep proving that the identity he rejects is still present. The film turns competence into a burden. Every successful reaction reminds him that the past is not merely something done to him, it is something trained into him. The title also carries an interesting tension. Supremacy sounds like dominance, confidence, and control, but Bourne begins from a position of emotional uncertainty. Other people may view him as a dangerous asset, a loose end, or a convenient explanation for events he did not choose. Bourne, meanwhile, is still trying to decide what responsibility belongs to him. He knows he has caused harm, even when the full shape of that harm remains incomplete. His need for answers is therefore not only practical, it is moral. Paul Greengrass directs this conflict with a restless physical language. The world rarely feels settled around Bourne. Streets, rooms, crowds, and transport systems seem to shift before he can fully occupy them. Yet beneath that movement is a quieter idea. A man can cross countries faster than he can cross the distance between guilt and accountability. The Bourne Supremacy asks whether truth can free someone whose greatest talent is survival, or whether survival itself has become another kind of prison. Before judging how well the film answers that, we first need to understand what kind of experience it offers and what it changes from the first Bourne story. The Bourne Supremacy feels colder, faster, and less interested in comfort than its predecessor. The Bourne identity allowed moments of discovery, connection, and even cautious hope as Jason tried to understand who he was. This sequel begins after that hope has already been tested. It does not treat peace as a new beginning. It treats peace as something temporary, vulnerable, and dependent on forces Bourne cannot control. As a spy thriller, the film delivers the expected machinery: surveillance, pursuit, political pressure, shifting loyalties, and movement across international locations. Yet its strongest quality is not the scale of its action. It is the way the action remains connected to Bourne's emotional condition. He is not chasing excitement, status, or victory. He moves because the life he tried to build has been violated and because someone has placed his identity inside a larger deception. That gives the film a different energy from a conventional heroic mission. Bourne is rarely trying to save an institution. He has little faith in institutions to begin with. His objective is narrower and more personal. Understand why he has been pulled back in, identify who is manipulating the situation, and regain some control over a life defined by missing information. Matt Damon's performance remains deliberately contained. Bourne does not explain every emotion, and the film does not ask him to. His tension appears through observation, delayed reactions, controlled speech, and the speed with which his attention shifts when a space stops feeling safe. That restraint suits a character who survives by revealing as little as possible. It also gives emotional weight to the moments when the control weakens. The immediate attraction of the film comes from that combination of intelligence and urgency. Bourne is highly capable, but the screenplay rarely presents his ability as effortless superiority. He is working with incomplete information while multiple groups act on assumptions, orders, or agendas he cannot yet see. The audience therefore experiences his skill and his vulnerability at the same time. Paul Greengrass brings a more agitated visual style to the series. The camera often feels close to the action, searching for the important detail at the same moment as the characters. This creates immediacy, especially during pursuit and surveillance sequences. It can also create distance for viewers who prefer cleaner geography and longer, more stable compositions. Some confrontations communicate pressure more clearly than physical space, and the editing occasionally prioritizes sensation over perfect orientation. That is the film's first meaningful limitation. The restlessness is purposeful, but purpose does not automatically make every moment equally readable. At its best, the style places us inside Bourne's alertness. At its weakest, it can make carefully constructed movement harder to appreciate because the image refuses to settle. The story also assumes that viewers are willing to follow institutional conversations involving intelligence operations, internal suspicion, and incomplete evidence. These scenes are generally efficient, but the emotional center remains far stronger when the film returns to Bourne. Supporting officials may have clear functions, yet not all of them receive enough depth to compete with the personal force of his journey. Viewers who connect with restrained performances, morally complicated protagonists, and thrillers built around consequence rather than spectacle are likely to find a great deal here. Those looking for a lighter adventure, a relaxed pace, or action presented with wide visual clarity may find the experience severe and occasionally abrasive. Still, the film's seriousness is one of its defining strengths. It understands that Bourne's past should not operate only as a source of impressive abilities. It should create guilt, uncertainty, and unfinished obligations. The plot moves because an operation goes wrong. Evidence points in a carefully chosen direction, and Bourne is forced to respond before he understands the complete design. That false trail becomes the story engine, turning a personal search for answers into a collision between private grief and institutional self-protection. The story begins by attacking the one thing Jason Bourne has managed to create without orders, a life chosen for himself. In Goa, he and Marie live quietly, but the quiet is already unstable. Bourne's sleep is interrupted by fragments of an earlier mission, and he records them because memory still arrives without context. He is not searching for another conflict. He is trying to understand whether the conflict inside him can ever end. Elsewhere, a CIA operation in Berlin collapses. Money disappears, agents are killed, and evidence is arranged to make Bourne appear responsible. The setup works because his history makes the accusation believable. He was trained to enter secure situations, act quickly, and vanish. To anyone examining the event from a distance, his name provides a convenient answer before harder questions are asked. This is the first mechanism driving the screenplay. Bourne is framed not despite his reputation, but through it. The abilities that once made him useful now make him easy to blame. The institution does not need to understand his current motives when his former identity already looks like proof. The second mechanism is more personal. Bourne notices a stranger moving through Goa with the concentration of someone following a target. His response is immediate because his instincts recognize danger before he has complete evidence. He tries to move Marie away from the threat, but the pursuit ends with her being killed during an attempt on his life. Her loss removes the person who connected Bourne to the possibility of living beyond Treadstone. That event locks him into the story. He could continue hiding, but hiding would mean accepting that the attack might happen again and that Marie's death would remain attached to an unexplained threat. He returns to the world he escaped, not because he trusts it, but because it contains the information he needs. Revenge is present in his anger, yet it is not a sufficient description of his objective. Bourne needs to discover who targeted him, why his name has reappeared, and how the attack connects to the memories disturbing him. Each answer promises safety, but it also carries a moral cost. The closer he moves toward the truth, the more he must confront what he did before he became capable of questioning his orders. The main obstacle is not a single pursuer. Bourne faces several systems of pressure operating with different information. Pamela Landy leads the CIA response to the Berlin failure and sees evidence pointing toward him. Her pursuit is not built on personal hatred. It is built on a reasonable interpretation of manipulated facts. That makes her more effective than a simple villain because Bourne cannot solve the problem merely by proving that she is corrupt. He must expose the deception while staying ahead of people who believe they are responding to a genuine threat. Bourne also cannot rely on the agency figures who once knew him. Treadstone may be officially finished, but its habits of secrecy and self-protection remain. Ward Abbott understands more about the past than he admits, while Landy is reconstructing events from incomplete records. Their positions create friction inside the CIA. Bourne is not moving against one unified mind. He is moving through an organization whose members possess different pieces of the truth. The screenplay gains momentum by repeatedly placing Bourne between observation and action. He enters a city with limited information, studies who is watching, identifies what the opposition believes, and changes the situation before they can adjust. The pleasure comes from watching him interpret systems faster than those systems can interpret him. Yet the film prevents that competence from becoming weightless. Every return to his old methods raises the same uncomfortable question: can he use the skills of an assassin without surrendering to the identity of one? His restraint matters because the story continually gives him reasons to abandon it. Grief pushes him toward punishment. Fear pushes him toward isolation. Institutional pursuit pushes him toward treating every person as an obstacle. Marie remains important after her absence because she represented another way for Bourne to measure himself. With her, survival was connected to a shared future. Without her, survival risks becoming automatic. The screenplay turns the external chase into a test of whether her influence survives when she is no longer present to interrupt his worst instincts. The cost of failure operates on 3 levels. The immediate cost is that Bourne may be captured or killed by people acting on false information. The larger cost is that the conspiracy may remain hidden, allowing those responsible to use him as permanent cover. The deepest cost is internal. If he responds to loss only through the violence he was trained to perform, then the people who shaped him still control the meaning of his actions. This is why the film's delays are as important as its bursts of movement. Bourne often reaches information only after someone else has altered the situation. Landy receives evidence that is persuasive but false. Agency teams arrive at places where Bourne has already understood the trap. Memories surface in pieces, giving him pressure before clarity. The screenplay withholds complete knowledge from every major character, then creates suspense by letting their partial understandings collide. The key relationship driving the middle of the film is the distant contest between Bourne and Landy. Each is trying to reconstruct the same crisis from opposite sides. Landy has institutional resources, personnel, and records. Bourne has speed, experience, and an intimate understanding of how the institution thinks. She sees him as the suspect at the center of the case. He sees her as both a danger and a possible route toward the truth. Their conflict works because neither side begins with the full picture. Bourne cannot contact the CIA and expect trust, while Landy cannot ignore evidence because it might have been manipulated. Each discovery solves one question and creates another. A name leads to a file. A file leads toward an older operation. That operation connects Bourne's present grief with guilt he has never fully processed. By the time he understands that the frame-up is connected to unfinished business inside the agency, the objective has changed. Clearing his name is no longer enough. Bourne must decide what kind of truth he is seeking. One kind identifies the people responsible for the current attack. Another forces him to acknowledge the consequences of his own past actions. That shift gives the thriller its moral direction. The conspiracy pulls Bourne back into motion, but guilt determines where that motion eventually leads. The story engine is built from false evidence, institutional secrecy, and pursuit across borders. Beneath it is a man discovering that innocence in the present does not erase responsibility for the past. The next question is what this pressure reveals. Bourne, Landy, Abbott, and the people pursuing them are defined less by what they claim to want than by what they choose when control begins to disappear. Jason Bourne's visible goal is simple enough to state. Identify who targeted him and understand why his name has been attached to a crime he did not commit. His less visible need is harder. He must decide whether learning the truth can become something other than permission to punish. The film places those two drives close together, then watches the pressure separate them. Bourne's greatest advantage is also his central contradiction. He can read danger with extraordinary speed, but he cannot always read himself with the same clarity. A crowded station, an unfamiliar vehicle, or a slight change in someone's behavior becomes useful information almost instantly. His own grief arrives differently. It is less organized, harder to control, and connected to memories that remain incomplete. He knows how to escape a physical trap. He does not yet know how to escape the emotional logic that tells him every injury must produce an answer through action. Matt Damon communicates that conflict by keeping Bourne's emotions compressed. He rarely performs grief as an open display. Instead, it appears in the space between his decisions. His voice becomes flatter when the situation is most personal. His body remains prepared even when his expression looks exhausted. That separation suggests a man whose training continues to function after the part of him that once accepted the mission has begun to reject it. The performance is especially effective because Bourne never seems unaware of his own capacity for harm. He does not enter confrontations believing that power makes him morally correct. He often appears to be measuring how much force the situation requires and how little he can use without losing control. That restraint gives the action ethical tension. The question is not merely whether he can defeat the person in front of him. It is whether he can stop when survival no longer requires more. His central fear is therefore larger than capture. Bourne fears that the identity created by Treadstone may be the only identity that reliably works. The ordinary life he attempted with Marie required trust, patience, and the acceptance of uncertainty. His old life rewards suspicion, speed, and emotional distance. Under pressure, the old system is easier. It asks him to reduce people to threats, routes, and useful information. Marie had challenged that reduction. She knew enough about Bourne's abilities to fear the world around him, yet she continued to treat him as a person rather than an instrument. Her importance is not limited to romance. She represented a witness to his attempt at change. With her gone, Bourne loses both emotional support and the person who could remind him that survival was supposed to lead somewhere. Franca Potent's brief presence carries weight because Marie's calm differs from Bourne's constant alertness. She does not erase his fear, but she gives it a human context. When Bourne becomes convinced that danger is approaching, their exchange reveals how differently they experience his instincts. To him, suspicion is a form of protection. To her, it is also the condition governing their entire life. The film does not need a long argument to establish the cost. Their routine has been built around threats that may appear at any moment. After the attack, Marie becomes an absence shaping every choice Bourne makes. The film repeatedly tests whether he will preserve what she brought out in him or allow her death to justify his return to pure retaliation. Her influence survives not as a sentimental memory, but as a standard against which his conduct can be measured. Pamela Landy creates a different kind of pressure. Unlike Bourne, she believes the institution can still produce truth if the evidence is examined correctly. Joan Allen plays her with directness and controlled authority. Landy's stillness often contrasts with the nervous energy surrounding her. She listens, questions, and pushes past convenient explanations, yet her confidence in procedure initially places her inside the deception. The distance between Landy and Bourne is not simply the distance between hunter and target. They represent competing methods of understanding. Landy builds a picture from records, witnesses, communications, and official authority. Bourne builds his from movement, behavior, memory, and the weaknesses of the system itself. Each method can expose facts, and each can be manipulated. Their conflict becomes compelling because Bourne recognizes that Landy may be more useful alive and thinking than defeated or humiliated. He studies her decisions and begins to separate her from the machinery pursuing him. Landy, in turn, gradually encounters details that resist the simple version of Bourne presented by the evidence. Their relationship develops through inference rather than trust. They are testing whether the other person is capable of changing position when the facts no longer support it. Ward Abbott responds to pressure in almost the opposite way. Brian Cox gives him the weary confidence of someone who understands how institutions protect themselves. Abbott speaks as though experience has given him the right to define reality for everyone else. Where Landy treats contradiction as a reason to investigate, Abbott often treats it as an inconvenience that should be contained. His power comes from familiarity. He knows the language of oversight, failure, and operational necessity. He understands that an organization embarrassed by its past may prefer a clean explanation to an uncomfortable truth. The film uses him to show how corruption can hide inside professional competence. A person does not need to behave like an obvious villain when he can make self-protection sound like institutional responsibility. Kirill applies pressure more physically. Karl Urban gives the assassin a disciplined, almost mechanical presence. He is not developed through extensive personal history because his function is to embody what Bourne might have remained, a highly trained figure moving from objective to objective without visible moral resistance. His efficiency creates a disturbing mirror. Bourne sees an opponent using similar skills without carrying the same hesitation. The contrast matters because the film refuses to define Bourne's humanity through weakness. He remains dangerous, observant, and technically superior in many situations. What separates him from Kirill is the growing ability to question the purpose behind those abilities. Bourne's moral development does not require him to become incapable. It requires him to decide that capability alone cannot determine his choices. Supporting characters strengthen the pressure when they possess information Bourne needs but cannot safely approach. Nicky Parsons, for example, carries knowledge of Treadstone and remembers the version of Bourne that existed before his escape. Julia Stiles plays her anxiety as recognition rather than simple fear. She understands what he can do, but she also senses that the man confronting her is not behaving exactly as the old program would predict. That uncertainty becomes important. People from Bourne's past expect a weapon, while the audience watches him struggle to become something else. Every encounter, therefore, contains two possible versions of him. One is the operative described in files and remembered by former colleagues. The other is the man trying to create a moral identity from the consequences those files leave out. Not every supporting figure receives the same complexity. Some agents mainly function as extensions of Landy's search, and several conversations exist to move information efficiently through the plot. Yet the strongest performances give the institutional scenes real tension because no one possesses complete certainty. Authority is repeatedly forced to confront the possibility that confidence and accuracy are not the same thing. Pressure reveals Bourne's deeper need by stripping away his excuses. He is innocent of the crime currently attached to his name, but the film does not allow that innocence to erase everything that came before it. He can expose the people using his past without pretending that the past contains no victims of his own actions. That is the deeper argument taking shape beneath the chase. Identity is not only what Bourne remembers, what the CIA records, or what his enemies accuse him of being. It is also what he chooses when grief, fear, and opportunity make the old response available again. The film's characters are measured by the moment when control begins to disappear, because that is when their values stop being statements and become behavior. On the surface, the Bourne Supremacy is about a former intelligence operative trying to prove that he has been framed. Beneath that pursuit, the film is asking a more difficult question about responsibility. Bourne wants the truth because the present accusation is false, yet the truth also leads him toward crimes from his past that are real. His innocence and his guilt exist at the same time, and the film refuses to let one cancel the other. That tension becomes the deep-view thread running through the story. Bourne is trying to escape an identity built by other people, but escape alone cannot create a new one. He can destroy documents, cross borders, abandon names, and disappear from surveillance, yet none of those actions answer what he owes to the people harmed by the person he used to be. Freedom requires more than avoiding punishment. It requires accepting responsibility without surrendering to the belief that he can never change. The film repeatedly connects identity with control. Treadstone controlled Bourne by reducing his value to performance. The program measured whether he could complete an assignment, adapt under pressure, and remove obstacles without hesitation. His memory loss breaks that system because he no longer accepts the institutional story explaining why those actions were necessary. Once the official purpose disappears, the actions remain, stripped of justification. That is why memory operates as both a threat and a moral demand. Bourne fears what he may remember, but he also needs the missing pieces. Without them, he cannot understand the source of his guilt or distinguish vague shame from specific responsibility. The fragments disturbing him are not simply clues for solving a mystery. They are evidence that his mind is pushing him toward something he has avoided confronting. The recurring image of movement reflects this instability. Bourne is almost always traveling, escaping, observing, or preparing to leave. Hotels, stations, streets, offices, and temporary rooms become spaces he uses rather than places he inhabits. He can understand an environment quickly, but he rarely belongs inside it. Movement protects him from capture while preventing the kind of stillness in which grief and memory might fully take shape. Marie briefly offered an alternative to that existence. Their life together was imperfect and shadowed by danger, but it gave Bourne a relationship not based on utility. She did not value him because he could perform a mission. She valued the person trying to emerge after the mission was over. Her death, therefore, threatens more than his happiness. It threatens the proof that another version of him was possible. The film could have used that loss as a simple excuse for revenge. Instead, it makes revenge an expectation Bourne must examine. The structure encourages us to understand his anger while watching for the point at which anger might begin to resemble the programming he claims to reject. The old Bourne was taught that an objective justified whatever action completed it. A grief-driven Bourne could repeat the same pattern with a different objective. This is where the film's treatment of choice becomes essential. Bourne cannot control what was done to him, what memories return, or how others use his reputation. He can control what he does once he understands the situation. The screenplay keeps placing him near the edge of familiar behavior, then makes restraint part of the character's development. That restraint is not presented as softness. Bourne remains capable of dominating many situations. The meaningful change is that he begins separating ability from obligation. He does not have to do everything he is able to do. This sounds simple, but for a character whose identity was constructed around flawless execution, the decision not to complete an act can become more significant than completing one. The institutions around him struggle with the same question on a larger scale. The CIA possesses enormous resources, access, and authority, but the film repeatedly asks whether capability has replaced judgment. Once Bourne is identified as the likely suspect, machinery begins moving before the underlying assumption has been fully tested. Surveillance and pursuit create the appearance of progress, even when they are built on manipulated evidence. Pamela Landy becomes important because she is willing to let new evidence challenge her initial position. Her authority does not make her automatically correct, but her commitment to investigation creates the possibility of correction. Abbott represents the opposite response. He protects control by managing information, trusting that institutional complexity will hide individual responsibility. Their contrast reflects Bourne's own internal conflict. Landy moves toward truth even when it damages the story she began with. Abbott reshapes truth to protect the position he already holds. Bourne must choose which pattern he will follow. He can use his intelligence to justify his anger, or he can allow uncomfortable facts to redirect him. The film also connects responsibility with visibility. Much of the conspiracy depends on victims being reduced to names in files or consequences being hidden behind operational language. Bourne's past actions were made easier because the people affected by them were treated as parts of an assignment rather than complete lives. His journey begins to change when those lives become visible again. This visibility does not arrive through abstract guilt. It becomes attached to particular people, relationships, and absences. The deeper Bourne looks, the harder it becomes to think of his past as something belonging only to the man he no longer remembers. The victims experience consequences whether he remembers causing them or not. At the same time, the film avoids arguing that a person is permanently identical to their worst actions. Bourne's responsibility matters precisely because his choices now can differ. Accountability would be meaningless if change were impossible. The film's moral tension comes from holding both ideas together. The past cannot be erased, and the future is not completely determined by it. This makes the title's suggestion of supremacy increasingly ironic. Real control does not come from being the most capable person in the room. Bourne often already possesses that advantage. The harder form of control is internal, choosing not to let training, rage, or fear make the decision automatically. The movie asks the viewer to accept that justice and revenge may begin from the same pain but move toward different conclusions. Revenge seeks to transfer suffering. Responsibility seeks to identify what happened, acknowledge its cost, and prevent the same logic from continuing. Bourne's path remains ambiguous because he is pursuing dangerous people through dangerous methods. The film does not pretend that every action fits cleanly into one category. That ambiguity is productive. Bourne is neither an innocent man untouched by his past nor a fixed weapon incapable of becoming human. He is caught between those readings, and the story gains force by refusing the easier one. His frame-up gives him a legitimate grievance. His memories deny him the comfort of believing that grievance explains everything. The deeper view, then, is not simply that Bourne must discover who is hunting him. He must decide what truth is for. It can become another tool for control, another justification for violence, or the beginning of responsibility. The answer will emerge most clearly when the film places specific scenes under pressure and allows framing, movement, sound, and performance to reveal what the characters cannot comfortably say. One of the film's clearest demonstrations of Jason Bourne's altered perception comes before the action fully announces itself. In Goa, danger enters through ordinary movement. A vehicle passes through the environment, people continue with their routines, and nothing in the setting openly declares that Bourne has been found. Yet his attention changes. He begins measuring distance, direction, and behavior while everyone around him remains inside the rhythm of daily life. The scene works because the camera does not give the audience a perfectly organized overview. We receive fragments close to Bourne's experience, a face glimpsed through motion, a vehicle that seems too deliberate, and a pattern that becomes threatening only after he connects the pieces. The editing does not present his reasoning as a spoken explanation. It lets the speed of his response prove that his body has reached a conclusion before his conscious mind has time to argue with it. This creates two kinds of suspense. The first is practical. Bourne may have been identified, and the approaching threat may already be too close. The second is emotional. Marie must decide whether to trust an alarm that she cannot independently confirm. The staging places her beside someone whose instincts have repeatedly kept them alive, but whose fear also controls the shape of their life. What feels to Bourne like necessary caution can feel to Marie like another moment in which the past takes command. Sound plays an important role here. The surrounding environment does not disappear when danger arrives. Traffic, engines, voices, and movement continue, forcing Bourne to isolate the meaningful signal from ordinary noise. That is how the film makes his intelligence visible. He does not receive special information. He extracts importance from details other people would ignore. The camera's instability increases as the threat becomes clearer, but the scene is not merely using motion to create excitement. The visual restlessness reflects the collapse of the life Bourne and Marie were attempting to build. The environment was supposed to be distant from Treadstone, yet the camera makes clear that distance cannot guarantee safety. The world tightens around them before Bourne can create a complete plan. A second revealing sequence occurs when Bourne reaches Naples and is brought into custody. The setting initially gives the authorities every advantage. He is contained, watched, and surrounded by people who believe they understand who he is. Bourne appears to occupy the weakest position in the room, but the scene gradually reverses that relationship. The staging emphasizes how quickly he studies the people around him. He notices access, routine, and communication rather than reacting emotionally to the fact that he has been detained. The officers see a prisoner. Bourne sees a temporary system with habits that can be predicted. This difference in perception becomes the source of his control. The editing moves between Bourne's restrained behavior and the official's confidence. That confidence is essential because it creates the opening he needs. They believe physical custody equals informational control. The film shows that those are different things. Bourne may be inside their space, but he understands the immediate situation faster than they do. What makes the sequence more than a display of competence is the purpose behind his actions. He is not trying to dominate the officers for pleasure. He needs access to the institutional conversation unfolding around his name. By listening, observing, and redirecting attention, he turns an attempted interrogation into a source of information. The camera remains close enough to make every movement feel immediate, yet the scene's real pleasure comes from the shift in knowledge. At the beginning, the authorities believe they possess both the man and the truth. By the end, Bourne has learned more about their investigation than they have learned about him. The power change happens through perception before it happens physically. This sequence also tests the deep view question in a subtle way. Bourne uses the skills of his former identity, but he does not use them toward the same purpose. Treadstone trained him to enter systems and complete assigned objectives. Here, he enters a system in order to uncover why that former identity is being used against him. The techniques remain familiar, while the moral direction has begun to change. A third scene places Bourne inside an apartment with Jarda, another former Treadstone operative. The location is domestic, contained, and visually ordinary, which makes the encounter more uncomfortable. These are not two strangers meeting on an open battlefield. They are products of the same hidden structure, facing each other in a space meant for private life. The staging initially allows conversation and physical distance. Bourne wants information, while Jarda understands that the encounter may threaten his survival. Their shared history creates tension before either man moves. Each knows what the other is capable of doing, so stillness becomes a form of calculation. When the confrontation turns physical, the filmmaking prioritizes impact, reaction, and improvisation over elegant presentation. The camera remains close, and the editing breaks the struggle into urgent pieces. Objects in the room become part of the conflict because neither man has the luxury of preparing a controlled encounter. The scene feels less like a performance of heroic combat than a collision between two people trained to react faster than ordinary judgment. The confined framing matters. There is little emotional or physical space available for reconsideration once the struggle begins. Bourne's old abilities return instantly, but the aftermath does not feel triumphant. The film does not frame the result as proof that he is superior and therefore justified. Instead, the scene leaves him with another reminder of what his training produces when situations narrow into survival. Jarda also functions as a warning. He represents a version of the former operative who has entered an ordinary-looking life without truly escaping the logic of the program. The apartment suggests stability, but their encounter reveals how quickly that surface can disappear. Bourne sees that changing location is not the same as changing identity. Across these scenes, Greengrass repeatedly places Bourne in environments that appear to belong to someone else. Goa belongs to the life he wants. Naples belongs to official authority. Jarda's apartment belongs to another survivor of Treadstone. Bourne enters each space, reads its pressure, and changes its balance. Yet the most important pattern is not that he wins. It is that every victory carries emotional evidence against the person he is trying to become. His perception protects him, his speed creates opportunity, and his training keeps him alive. The scene lab reveals the film's deeper tension. The same craft choices that make Bourne's ability thrilling also make its human cost impossible to ignore. The Bourne Supremacy creates its distinctive pressure by making direction, camera movement, editing, sound, and performance operate as one system. None of these elements is trying to remain invisible. The film wants the viewer to feel that information is unstable, that safety can disappear between one glance and the next, and that Bourne's awareness is always moving faster than the environment around him. Paul Greengrass directs action through proximity rather than distance. The camera frequently stays close to faces, hands, vehicles, and fragments of movement. Instead of showing every location as a perfectly organized diagram, the film gives us the pieces that matter at the moment a character notices them. A doorway becomes important because someone pauses near it. A face in a crowd matters because Bourne looks twice. A vehicle becomes threatening because its speed no longer matches the surrounding traffic. This approach aligns the viewer with Bourne's perception without pretending that we possess his complete understanding. He often recognizes the pattern before we do. The camera gives us evidence, but it does not always explain which piece will become decisive. That slight delay allows his intelligence to feel active. We are not simply told that he is observant. The filmmaking repeatedly places us close enough to witness his observation while keeping us uncertain about its conclusion. The cinematography also makes public spaces feel strangely restrictive. Train stations, streets, offices, and crowded buildings should offer room to disappear, yet the close framing often turns them into compressed environments. Bourne may be surrounded by hundreds of people, but the image isolates the small number who could expose him. Crowds become both cover and threat. That visual tension supports the film's argument about identity. Bourne can change his location, appearance, and direction, but the camera rarely allows him to appear fully free. Even wide environments are broken into narrow choices. There is always another corner to examine, another reflection to check, or another person entering the frame with uncertain purpose. Christopher Rouse's editing strengthens this sensation by prioritizing decisions over decorative continuity. Cuts often arrive at the instant a character identifies a problem or changes strategy. The rhythm therefore follows thought as much as physical action. Bourne sees something, calculates its meaning, and moves. The film cuts with him, creating the impression that perception itself is driving the sequence. During pursuits, the editing can become aggressively fragmented. This has a clear dramatic benefit. It prevents action from feeling comfortable or ceremonial. Collisions, changes of direction, and sudden obstacles register as shocks rather than carefully displayed achievements. The viewer experiences urgency more strongly than elegance. The cost is that physical geography can occasionally become difficult to follow. The film sometimes communicates that Bourne is under pressure more clearly than it communicates the exact position of every person or vehicle. That trade-off is central to its style. Greengrass and Rouse are not primarily presenting action as a clean exhibition of choreography. They are presenting it as a rapidly changing problem being solved under stress. Sound design fills the gaps created by the restless image. Engines, footsteps, telephones, traffic, radio communication, doors, and distant voices constantly provide information beyond the frame. Bourne's world is never limited to what the camera can show at once. A sound can announce movement before its source becomes visible, creating the feeling that danger continues outside the image. The film's quieter moments use sound just as carefully. Silence around Bourne rarely feels peaceful. It gives his attention room to expand. Without loud music telling us exactly what to expect, small noises become suspicious. The absence of obvious warning increases tension because Bourne must decide whether an ordinary sound belongs to ordinary life. John Powell's score supports this momentum without replacing it. The music often works through repeated pulses and accumulating layers, creating forward pressure rather than a simple heroic theme. It helps connect separate locations and parallel investigations, suggesting that Bourne, Landy, and the conspiracy are moving toward the same collision even when they do not yet understand one another. The score is most effective when it does not celebrate Bourne's competence. Its energy can make his movement exciting, but the darker textures keep that excitement connected to grief and danger. The film rarely allows the audience to forget that his abilities were created for destructive purposes. Momentum and unease remain present together. Performance completes the system. Matt Damon's restraint gives the camera something precise to search for. Because Bourne does not constantly explain himself, small changes in his gaze and posture become meaningful. The editing can move rapidly around him while his expression remains controlled, making him appear both central to the chaos and emotionally separated from it. Joan Allen creates a different rhythm. Landy's authority is expressed through stillness, direct questioning, and her willingness to remain focused while others become defensive. When the film cuts between her controlled investigation and Bourne's physical movement, it builds a contrast between two forms of intelligence. She works through institutional access and evidence. He works through immediate perception and experience. Brian Cox brings another texture to the film. Abbott's controlled exhaustion suggests someone accustomed to shaping conversations before other people understand what is at stake. His scenes depend less on physical movement and more on pauses, deflections, and the management of information. The camera's closeness makes those small adjustments visible, allowing suspicion to develop through behavior rather than explanation. Production design supports these performances by avoiding glamorous spy environments. Offices feel functional, apartments feel temporary, and operational spaces are filled with ordinary equipment rather than futuristic spectacle. This makes the conspiracy more believable because it exists inside recognizable institutions and rooms. Harm is organized through desks, files, phones, and meetings, not only through weapons or pursuit. The craft systems therefore converge around one effect: control always feels provisional. Bourne appears highly capable, yet the camera denies him complete visual stability. Landy possesses authority, yet the editing reveals how much of her investigation depends on incomplete information. Abbott understands the system, yet sound, performance, and framing gradually expose the pressure behind his confidence. The style does more than decorate the thriller. It places the audience inside a world where knowledge arrives in fragments, and every fragment may change the meaning of the last one. When the film is working at its best, technique and theme become inseparable. The restless camera, compressed spaces, urgent cuts, layered sound, and controlled performances all express the same idea. Surviving a system is not the same as escaping what that system has made of you. The Bourne Supremacy's most consequential weakness comes from the same formal choice that gives it much of its identity. Its restless camera and compressed editing create urgency, but they sometimes reduce physical clarity at the exact moment the action should reveal Bourne's intelligence most clearly. A Bourne sequence is usually compelling because the character does more than move quickly. He studies geography, predicts behavior, and turns an opponent's confidence against them. When the framing becomes too fragmented, the audience can feel the pressure without fully appreciating the decision that resolves it. We understand that Bourne has escaped or gained an advantage, but the chain of observation leading to that result may be less readable than the outcome. This matters because competence is part of the film's character writing. Bourne's skill is not merely decoration between dramatic scenes. It shows how deeply his training has shaped his perception. A wider view or a slightly longer cut could sometimes make his choices more impressive by allowing us to understand the problem before watching him solve it. Instead, a few sequences create intensity by withholding so much spatial information that Bourne's success can feel delivered by editing rather than demonstrated through reasoning. The strongest defense of this approach is that perfect clarity would weaken the intended experience. Bourne does not move through a stable world, and the film does not want the audience observing him from a comfortable distance. The camera is meant to share the instability of pursuit, the partial information available in a crowd, and the sudden violence of plans collapsing. Confusion is not always an accident. Sometimes it is the emotional subject of the scene. That defense is convincing up to a point. The style fits Bourne's damaged attention and the film's atmosphere of institutional uncertainty. It makes danger feel immediate rather than polished. Yet emotional disorientation and visual uncertainty do not always need to be identical. The film is strongest when the viewer feels overwhelmed while still understanding the essential choice. It is weaker when the cutting conceals the choice itself. A smaller limitation appears in the supporting characters. Pamela Landy, Abbott, Marie, and several figures connected to Treadstone carry meaningful dramatic functions, but others remain primarily informational. They deliver updates, follow orders, or react to Bourne's movements without developing an independent relationship to the film's moral argument. That efficiency keeps the story moving, but it can make the institutional world feel narrower than it first appears. The CIA is presented as a complicated organization containing competing motives and incomplete knowledge. More distinct perspectives among the secondary agents could have strengthened that idea. Instead, many of them function as extensions of Landy's investigation or Abbott's resistance. The film's focus on Bourne provides a reasonable explanation. This is not intended as an ensemble study of intelligence work. Supporting characters are often presented according to how Bourne encounters the system, as voices, barriers, observers, or sources of information. Their limited depth helps preserve his isolation. He moves through an organization filled with people, yet very few can see him as anything beyond a file or a threat. The result is therefore more limiting than destructive. Landy has enough intelligence and moral independence to challenge the institution from within. Abbott gives secrecy a recognizable human face. The less developed figures reduce texture, but they do not damage the central conflict. The movie also moves so quickly that some emotional transitions receive less space than their importance might deserve. Marie's death defines Bourne's direction, yet the thriller's momentum soon demands travel, surveillance, and investigation. Damon's restrained performance preserves the grief beneath those events, but viewers who need more open emotional processing may feel that the film converts loss into forward motion too rapidly. Once again, the strongest defense lies in character. Bourne has been trained to respond to pain through action. His refusal to stop and openly process what happened is not necessarily a missing scene. It may be evidence of the damage the story is examining. The emotional distance becomes meaningful when the film eventually forces him into forms of responsibility that cannot be solved through escape. These weaknesses are inseparable from the film's strengths. A calmer visual style might offer clearer action, but lose the anxious immediacy that distinguishes this chapter. More supporting character development might enrich the institution, but interrupt the severe focus on Bourne. Longer pauses after major events might deepen the grief while weakening the feeling that he is running because standing still has become unbearable. The friction does not break the movie. It defines the terms on which a viewer must meet it. The Bourne Supremacy chooses pressure over elegance, momentum over spaciousness, and emotional restraint over explanation. Those choices can be abrasive, but they are rarely careless. The film's limitations emerge because it commits so completely to Bourne's unstable experience that it sometimes asks clarity to carry too much of the cost. The Bourne Supremacy occupies an important place in the evolution of the modern spy thriller because it treats espionage less as fantasy than as a system of pressure. The film contains international travel, covert operations, professional assassins, and intelligence agencies, but it removes much of the glamour traditionally attached to those elements. Cities are not presented as luxurious destinations. They are networks of roads, stations, offices, hotels, and surveillance points through which information and danger move. That distinction separates Jason Bourne from the more theatrical tradition of the invincible secret agent. He does not enter a room to display status. He enters it to locate exits, identify attention, and understand who controls the space. His clothes, vehicles, and temporary identities are functional rather than aspirational. The appeal comes from adaptation, not luxury. This practical emphasis had already been established in the Bourne identity, but the sequel makes it harsher. The first film contained the excitement of discovery as Bourne learned what he could do. The Bourne Supremacy removes much of that novelty. His abilities are no longer surprising to him, and the audience understands their source. The question has shifted from what kind of man he was to what kind of man he can become while those abilities remain. Paul Greengrass also changes the franchise's physical language. The action feels more immediate, less polished, and more vulnerable to sudden disruption. Rather than presenting violence as a carefully staged display of superiority, the film often makes it feel like the breakdown of an already unstable situation. This approach helped define a period of action filmmaking in which proximity, rapid cutting, and handheld movement became associated with realism and urgency. The wider influence of that style is complicated. When used with the same connection between character and form found here, instability can place the viewer inside a specific emotional condition. When copied only as surface technique, it can become visual noise. The Bourne Supremacy works better than many of its imitators because its restlessness belongs to the protagonist. The camera does not shake merely because the film wants energy. It reflects a man who cannot experience public space without scanning it for danger. The movie also belongs to a period when popular thrillers were increasingly suspicious of the institutions their heroes served. The CIA is not portrayed as a single evil body, nor as an unquestionably noble one. It contains investigators seeking truth, officials protecting themselves, professionals following incomplete orders, and buried operations whose consequences continue after their official closure. That structure gives the film more durability than a simpler story about one corrupt superior. Bourne is fighting both individual decisions and an institutional habit of turning people into manageable information. His name can be attached to a file, his history can be used to explain a crime, and his current intentions can be ignored because the recorded version of him is easier to process. Within the larger Bourne series, this chapter deepens the cost of the first film's escape. Leaving Treadstone did not end the relationships, victims, and secrets created by it. The sequel understands that a character cannot simply walk away from one story and begin another without consequence. Bourne's attempt to build a private life is interrupted because the system remembers him even when he cannot fully remember himself. This is also what distinguishes the film from a standard revenge narrative. The initial emotional force points toward retaliation, but the wider genre frame gradually shifts toward accountability. Bourne's most important destination is not the location of an enemy. It is the point where he must decide whether his pain gives him the right to repeat the logic that produced it. The Bourne Supremacy therefore expands the spy thriller by narrowing its hero's moral space. The international conspiracy may be large, but the decisive conflict remains intimate. A man trained to cross borders and defeat systems must discover whether he can stop treating responsibility as another target to eliminate. The first production decision that changes how the Bourne Supremacy should be read is the arrival of Paul Greengrass. Doug Liman, who directed The Bourne Identity, remained involved as an executive producer, but Greengrass took control of the sequel's direction. The change explains why this chapter feels less like a continuation of the first film's visual comfort and more like a deliberate tightening of its anxiety. Greengrass later described his approach to Bourne in terms that closely matched the finished film. He wanted to strip the character back, reduce how much he spoke, make him more enigmatic, and shape the story as a movement from revenge toward atonement. That is not merely an interesting statement of intention. It clarifies why Bourne's silence carries so much narrative weight. The film does not withhold dialogue because it has nothing to say. It turns behavior into the argument. The revenge to atonement structure also explains why the opening loss cannot be understood only as motivation for an action plot. The event pushes Bourne toward retaliation, but the direction keeps asking whether that response can develop into something morally different. His physical journey moves outward across countries, while the intended emotional journey moves inward toward responsibility. A second useful fact is Matt Damon's level of physical participation. Contemporary reporting noted that he performed much of the fighting and stunt work himself, despite having less preparation time than he had for the first film. That involvement helps explain why Bourne's movement feels connected to Damon's performance rather than separated into moments handled entirely by editing or doubles. The important result is not simply realism. Damon's physical control allows Bourne's personality to remain visible during action. His movements are economical, defensive, and focused on immediate necessity. The sequences rarely feel like pauses in the characterization because the way he moves continues to express how he thinks. The film's location work adds another layer. Production traveled through settings including Goa, Naples, Berlin, and Moscow, rather than placing the entire international story inside one visually uniform environment. Each location therefore applies a different kind of pressure. Goa offers openness that proves vulnerable. Berlin turns modern architecture and institutional spaces into a network of observation. Moscow becomes colder, denser, and increasingly difficult to control. These locations do not function as tourism. Production designer Dominic Watkins and cinematographer Oliver would use them as practical environments filled with barriers, crowds, reflective surfaces, narrow passages, traffic, and temporary shelter. Bourne rarely pauses to admire where he is because each place is defined by how quickly it can expose or contain him. Finally, the credited combination of Wood's cinematography, Christopher Rouse and Richard Pearson's editing, and John Powell's music reveals that the film's agitation was not produced by one department working alone. Image, cutting, rhythm, and sound were aligned around Bourne's incomplete knowledge. The production evidence supports the central reading rather than distracting from it. Greengrass's stated movement from revenge to atonement, Damon's direct physical performance, the changing textures of real locations, and the coordinated visual and editorial system all point toward the same design. The film was constructed to make Bourne's body move with certainty, while his moral identity remains unsettled. The strongest alternative reading of the Bourne Supremacy is that Jason Bourne's journey is not primarily a movement from revenge toward responsibility. It can also be understood as a struggle to recover control. From this perspective, his moral development matters, but it remains secondary to his refusal to let governments, assassins, and hidden records define what happens to him next. The evidence for this reading is strong. Bourne returns because someone attacks his life, kills Marie, and uses his identity to conceal another crime. His investigation begins with a practical need to identify the threat and prevent another attack. Even when buried memories become relevant, he continues approaching the problem as an operative. Gather information, isolate the responsible people, expose the weakness in their structure, and leave before the system can contain him. This version of Bourne is less a man searching for redemption than a man resisting ownership. Treadstone once controlled his assignments, movements, and identity. The frame-up attempts to control him again by turning his past into a ready-made explanation. Clearing his name becomes a declaration that the institution no longer has the right to write his story. Several of his choices support that interpretation. He rarely submits himself to an external process of judgment. He decides which people to confront, what information to reveal, and when the truth has been sufficiently established. Even his restraint remains self-directed. He does not follow a new institution's moral rules. He creates limits for himself and enforces them according to his own understanding. The ending can therefore be read not as surrender to responsibility, but as the completion of autonomy. Bourne confronts the past because unresolved guilt still influences him. By naming what happened and facing someone affected by it, he removes another form of control. The memory no longer operates only as a fragment capable of disturbing him without explanation. It becomes something he can recognize, describe, and carry consciously. This counter-reading weakens the idea that accountability is the film's only destination. Bourne does not repair all the damage he caused, nor does he place himself inside a formal system designed to judge it. His actions are selective and personal. He decides which truth must be spoken and what consequence is appropriate. That can look less like complete atonement and more like an effort to regain psychological balance. There is also a harder interpretation beneath this one. Bourne may be using responsibility as another form of control. By choosing the moment, language, and limits of his acknowledgement, he remains the person directing the encounter. He offers truth, but he cannot offer restoration. The people harmed by his past do not receive equal power over what happens next, yet the autonomy reading leaves something unresolved. If control were Bourne's only objective, exposing the conspiracy and escaping would be enough. The later choices that carry no clear tactical benefit suggest that he has moved beyond self-preservation. He approaches pain that cannot improve his operational position and accepts a form of vulnerability his training would normally reject. The responsibility reading explains those choices more completely. Bourne begins by trying to regain control over the present, but the investigation reveals that control without moral recognition would reproduce the logic of Treadstone. The program taught him that success meant completing the objective while treating consequences as someone else's problem. His growth appears when consequence becomes part of the objective itself. Still, the counter-reading improves the central argument because it prevents Bourne's change from becoming too clean. He does not transform into an entirely open or institutionally accountable person. He remains secretive, self-directed, and capable of leaving once he has done what he believes is necessary. His atonement is incomplete because his identity is still being rebuilt through habits formed inside the system he rejects. The most convincing position holds both readings together. Bourne seeks control because control was taken from him, and he seeks responsibility because control alone cannot give his new life meaning. His freedom depends on choosing for himself, but the value of that freedom depends on what he chooses to do with the truth. The Bourne Supremacy rewards a second viewing less through hidden trivia than through repeated patterns of control. Once the full shape of the conspiracy is understood, ordinary gestures begin to reveal who is directing events, who is protecting a lie, and who is quietly losing the ability to contain it. one recurring signal is the film's use of observation through barriers. Bourne is frequently seen through windows, doorways, crowds, vehicle glass, or surveillance equipment. These layers create the impression that he is always being watched, yet they also remind us that the observers rarely see the complete person. The agencies tracking him possess images, records, and fragments of movement. They can identify where he has been without understanding why he is moving. On a first viewing, this pattern mainly creates suspense. On a second, it becomes part of the film's argument about identity. Bourne's institutional image is constructed from partial evidence, just as the Berlin accusation is built from evidence arranged to support a false conclusion. The camera repeatedly asks whether seeing someone is the same as knowing them. Reflections create a related effect. Bourne often studies environments indirectly, using glass, mirrors, or the reactions of others to understand what is happening outside his immediate view. This is a practical survival habit, but it also reflects his psychological condition. He is trying to understand himself indirectly through memories, files, former colleagues, and the consequences left behind by someone he no longer fully recognizes. The performance signals are equally important. Matt Damon often lets Bourne's attention shift before the rest of his body responds. His eyes locate a problem, his expression closes, and only then does he move. On the first viewing, this reads as competence. After the later revelations, it also shows how much of his life remains automatic. His body still carries a system of knowledge that his conscious identity is trying to question. Pamela Landy's reactions form a quieter pattern. Early in the investigation, she listens with the confidence of someone assembling a difficult but manageable case. As contradictions accumulate, Joan Allen slightly changes the rhythm. Her pauses grow more deliberate, and her questions begin testing the people around her rather than merely collecting information from them. The shift is subtle because Landy does not experience a dramatic conversion. She gradually recognizes that the official version is becoming harder to defend. Abbott's behavior moves in the opposite direction. His authority initially appears relaxed because he understands the organization and expects experience to protect him. On a rewatch, his interruptions, dismissals, and attempts to narrow the investigation carry more meaning. Moments that first resemble professional impatience begin to look like efforts to control which questions can be asked. The film also repeats the idea of delayed arrival. Agents reach locations after Bourne has moved. Information becomes useful only after someone has manipulated it. Memories surface after their consequences are already present. This delay creates the sense that every character is pursuing an event that began before they understood its importance. Even the changing cities participate in that design. Bourne moves through locations that become progressively colder and more restrictive. The early possibility of distance and escape gives way to offices, transit systems, enclosed rooms, and crowded roads. The geography narrows as the moral issue becomes more specific. He begins by searching for whoever attacked him, but the route steadily directs him toward something he cannot solve by continuing to run. Small moments involving names also gain weight on a second viewing. Bourne's identity has been divided among aliases, records, and institutional labels. Yet the story gradually returns attention to the real people behind those labels. A name can be used to frame someone, erase someone, or finally acknowledge someone who had previously existed only as part of an assignment. These signals show that the film is designed around more than surprise. The later knowledge does not merely explain who arranged the immediate deception. It changes the meaning of Bourne's memories, Landy's investigation, Abbott's confidence, and the destination toward which the entire story has been moving. The decisive answer must remain outside this section. What can be seen already is that the film has been preparing two revelations at once. One concerns the machinery behind the present pursuit. The other concerns why Bourne's fragmented memory is leading him toward a responsibility far more personal than clearing his name. From this point on, the ending, the reveals, and their meaning are all on the table. If you want the film unspoiled, pause here and come back after you've seen it. The central deception is finally exposed when Bourne's investigation leads him back to Berlin and to the operation that first placed his identity at the scene of a crime. The evidence against him was not mistaken. It was deliberately planted. Kirill used Bourne's fingerprint to redirect the CIA's attention after stealing the files and money connected to the failed transaction. That choice turns Bourne's reputation into a weapon. The frame-up succeeds because the agency already possesses a version of him that seems capable of anything. The immediate consequence is that Pamela Landy has been pursuing the wrong man while the real conspiracy remains inside the structure surrounding her. The larger meaning is more uncomfortable. Institutions do not need to invent an entirely false identity for Bourne. They only need to select the most frightening pieces of his real one and present them without context. His past makes the lie efficient. When Bourne confronts Nicky Parsons, he does so under conditions that initially resemble the behavior Landy fears. He isolates someone with information, controls the space, and forces the conversation toward what he needs. Yet the scene gradually distinguishes him from the operative described in the old files. Nicky is frightened because she remembers what Treadstone created. Bourne is frightening because those abilities remain present, but his objective is no longer blind completion. Nicky reveals that the operation connected to the Berlin case was never one of Bourne's assignments. This removes the most immediate accusation, but it does not give him peace. Her information directs him toward a different memory, one involving Vladimir Nevsky, a Russian politician who had been preparing to expose financial corruption. Bourne's fragmented images are not warning him about the current frame-up. They are returning him to his first assignment. That distinction changes the structure of the entire film. The plot appeared to be moving toward proof of Bourne's innocence. Instead, it places innocence beside guilt. He did not commit the Berlin killings attached to his name, but he did kill Nevsky and Nevsky's wife years earlier, then left the scene arranged to misdirect the investigation. The present conspiracy and the buried mission are connected through money, secrecy, and the belief that human lives can be reorganized into a convenient official story. The man protecting that story is Ward Abbott. His connection to the stolen funds explains why he repeatedly tries to contain Landy's investigation. He is not simply defending the agency from embarrassment. He is defending the private arrangement hidden inside an old operation. Bourne's reputation gives Abbott the ideal cover because it turns a former asset into a suspect who cannot safely appear and defend himself. Bourne's confrontation with Abbott becomes the decisive moral test of the revenge reading. Abbott expects him to arrive as an executioner. From Abbott's perspective, Bourne's grief and training should produce a predictable result. If Bourne eliminates him, the conspiracy loses a witness, the agency sees more evidence of Bourne's guilt, and Abbott's understanding of him is confirmed. Instead, Bourne records Abbott's admission and refuses to become the final mechanism of the cover-up. This is one of the film's most important reversals. The old Bourne completed objectives by removing people. The emerging Bourne completes this objective by preserving truth. His restraint is not passivity. It is a deliberate rejection of the outcome Abbott has prepared for him. The consequence is that Landy receives evidence capable of changing the investigation. More importantly, Bourne proves to himself that anger does not have to determine the form of justice. He entered the room with every emotional reason to punish the man whose actions led the threat to Goa. He leaves with something more useful than retaliation, a record that allows the lie to collapse. Abbott is no longer available for questioning when Landy reaches him, but the recorded confession survives. The film avoids turning that moment into a clean institutional victory. Truth reaches the agency, yet it arrives after damage that cannot be repaired. Marie remains dead. The agents killed in Berlin remain victims of a deception they did not understand. Bourne's earlier victims cannot be restored by exposing a newer crime. The conspiracy also extends beyond Abbott to Yuri Gretkov, whose financial interests benefited from Nevsky's removal and from the stolen money hidden through the old arrangement. This wider connection matters because it prevents the story from reducing corruption to one damaged official. Private ambition and public authority have supported each other. Intelligence resources created secrecy, while financial power gave that secrecy a motive. Landy can now act against Gretkov because Bourne has delivered the missing connection. Their distant contest changes meaning here. She began by using the institution to hunt him. He ends by giving her the evidence needed to correct the institution's course. Neither fully joins the other, but they become temporary partners in truth without ever establishing ordinary trust. Bourne could disappear at this point. His name has effectively been separated from the Berlin attack, and the immediate conspiracy has been exposed. If control were his only goal, the story could end there. Instead, he travels to Moscow. That decision confirms that clearing his name was never the complete destination. Kirill is also in Moscow, still functioning according to the logic Bourne is trying to leave behind. His pursuit of Bourne produces the film's largest chase, but the sequence is more than a final contest between equally skilled men. Kirill represents action without reflection. He has followed objectives, removed obstacles, and continued moving because the next assignment gives him direction. Bourne recognizes that pattern because it once organized his own life. The chase is filmed as a violent breakdown of control rather than a polished duel. Vehicles force their way through narrow streets, direction changes without warning, and both men operate with diminishing certainty. The editing fragments the geography, but the emotional line remains clear. Bourne is being pulled toward the ending a revenge story normally promises. Kirill's vehicle finally crashes, leaving him unable to continue the pursuit. Bourne approaches and sees that the man responsible for Marie's death is no longer an immediate threat. This is the point where ability and choice separate completely. Bourne has the advantage. The old program would treat the remaining person as an unfinished objective. Grief could easily make the same demand. Bourne chooses to leave him alive. That decision does not forgive Kirill, erase Marie's death, or deny the suffering he caused. It establishes a boundary around Bourne's response. He refuses to let Marie's memory become permission to repeat the values that destroyed their life together. By stopping, he preserves the part of himself she helped create. The film then redirects its attention from the man who harmed Bourne to the person Bourne harmed. This is the most significant turn in the ending. He finds Irina Nevsky, the daughter of the couple killed during his first assignment. She has lived with an official explanation that made one parent appear responsible for both deaths. Bourne arrives not to obtain information, defeat an enemy, or protect himself. He arrives because she has been carrying a lie created by his actions. He tells her that her mother did not kill her father and that the deaths were made to look like a private tragedy. He acknowledges his role without asking Irina to comfort him or excuse what he did. The scene is restrained because no emotional display could balance the loss. Bourne cannot repair her family. He can only stop participating in the false story imposed on it. This encounter resolves the repeated pattern of names and files. Nevsky was once an assignment. His wife was turned into part of the cover. Their daughter became an unseen consequence outside the operational record. By standing in front of Irina, Bourne forces himself to recognize the complete human reality that Treadstone trained him to ignore. The apology is therefore not a declaration that his guilt has ended. It is the beginning of accountability. Bourne gives Irina the truth even though it offers him no tactical advantage and may deepen her pain before it gives her clarity. He accepts that truth belongs to the person affected by his actions, not only to the person seeking relief from guilt. This also resolves the film's central question. Bourne searches for truth without becoming the weapon his enemies expect, but he does not achieve that by abandoning his abilities. He uses observation, deception, physical skill, and strategic control throughout the story. The transformation lies in the purpose governing those abilities and in his willingness to stop when violence is no longer necessary. The final exchange with Landy adds one more layer. She later contacts him with information about the identity beneath the Jason Bourne name, David Webb. The agency now offers him a piece of the personal history it once concealed. Yet Bourne does not rush back into its control simply because it possesses answers. He demonstrates that he is still watching from a distance and ends the exchange on his own terms. That moment holds the autonomy and responsibility readings together. David Webb is not a magical return to innocence. Recovering a birth name cannot erase the actions performed as Bourne. At the same time, the name proves that the institutional identity was never the whole person. There was a life before Treadstone, and there may be a life after it. The last movement does not give Bourne peace, it gives him direction. He has exposed the people exploiting his past, refused to complete revenge, acknowledged a victim he had previously reduced to an assignment, and recovered another fragment of himself. None of those actions restores what was lost. Together, they show that change is possible without pretending that consequence disappears. The film earns its ending because it does not confuse redemption with acquittal. Bourne is innocent of the crime that begins the pursuit and responsible for the act that finally defines its moral conclusion. His supremacy is not the ability to defeat every opponent. It is the difficult control required to reject the purpose for which his abilities were created. Marie's influence survives in that rejection. Abbott expects a weapon and receives a witness. Kirill expects a finishing blow and is left alive. Irina expects to continue living inside an old lie and receives the truth from the person who helped create it. Bourne cannot change the past, but he changes what the past makes him do next. The final image of Bourne moving anonymously through the city keeps that freedom provisional. He is still alone, still looking from outside, and still unable to enter ordinary life without caution. The difference is that his isolation no longer feels like pure escape. It now carries a conscious moral direction. He cannot choose what he was trained to become, but he can choose whether the next action protects the old machinery or interrupts it. That modest distinction is more convincing than a complete transformation would have been. That is the final answer of the Bourne Supremacy. Truth does not free Bourne by proving he was always innocent. It frees him by allowing innocence, guilt, grief, and choice to exist together without letting any one of them become his entire identity. What remains after the Bourne Supremacy is not the loudest collision, the most elaborate escape, or even the exposure of the conspiracy. It is the quiet image of Jason Bourne sitting across from Irina Neski, with no operation left to complete and nowhere for his training to hide him. Throughout the film, Bourne survives by controlling distance. He watches people before approaching them. He enters spaces only after identifying the exits. He reveals information selectively and leaves before anyone can hold him in place. In Irina's apartment, that control becomes almost useless. He can choose his words and decide when to leave, but he cannot manage what the truth will mean to her. That is why the scene stays with the film after its machinery has stopped moving. Bourne has already proven that he can outthink investigators, escape containment, expose corruption, and survive a pursuit through Moscow. None of those achievements asks as much of him as facing one person whose life was permanently altered by an assignment he once completed without question. The film does not turn the meeting into emotional absolution. Irina does not erase his guilt, and Bourne does not ask her to. He gives her the truth that was taken from her and accepts that the truth cannot restore what she lost. The restraint of the scene protects it from becoming a convenient redemption ceremony. It is not an ending to responsibility. It is the first moment in which Bourne accepts responsibility without converting it into another tactical problem. That distinction allows the movie to grow after reflection. During the first viewing, the story's speed naturally pulls attention toward pursuit, surveillance, and revelation. Once the plot is understood, its emotional construction becomes clearer. Marie's death initially appears to launch a revenge narrative, but her real influence is visible in every moment when Bourne refuses to become entirely governed by revenge. He does not honor Marie by destroying everyone connected to her death. He honors what their life represented by proving that the person she trusted was not an illusion. The man capable of tenderness, restraint, and moral choice still exists beneath the instincts designed by Treadstone. The film leaves a difficult human question open. How does someone take responsibility for actions committed while their identity was being controlled, damaged, or deliberately reshaped? Bourne was manipulated, trained, and stripped of parts of himself, but the people harmed by his actions experienced real consequences. The movie avoids the comfort of choosing only one side. He was used and he caused harm. He deserves the opportunity to change, and others still deserve recognition of what was done to them. That tension gives the film more weight than a straightforward story of innocence. Bourne does not discover that every accusation against him is false. He discovers that proving the current accusation false does not settle the moral account. His movement toward Irina is therefore more important than his movement away from the CIA. One proves that he can escape a system. The other suggests that he may be capable of becoming accountable outside it. The Deep View question asked whether Bourne could uncover the truth without allowing grief to turn him into the weapon his enemies expected. The answer is yes, but not because he becomes free of anger, violence, or the instincts of his past. He succeeds because those forces stop having the final vote. For me, the Bourne Supremacy earns an 8.4 out of 10. That score reflects how successfully the film combines physical urgency with moral consequence. Its greatest achievement is the way it makes Bourne's competence part of the character problem rather than an uncomplicated fantasy. His ability to read danger is exciting, but it also reveals how completely danger has shaped him. His capacity for force keeps him alive, but every confrontation asks whether survival is enough to justify using it. Matt Damon's controlled performance gives that conflict credibility. He never needs to announce Bourne's grief or explain every stage of his transformation. The film trusts posture, hesitation, attention, and silence. Joan Allen provides an equally valuable counterweight as Pamela Landy, whose intelligence comes from her willingness to change her conclusion when the evidence stops supporting it. Brian Cox and Carl Urban embody two different threats: the institutional figure who manipulates truth and the operative who continues acting without moral resistance. Paul Greengrass's direction gives the sequel a distinct identity. The handheld camera, compressed framing, rapid cutting, layered sound, and constant environmental movement create a thriller that feels alert in every frame. This is not a world arranged for the hero's entrance. It is a world Bourne must interpret while it is already shifting around him. The limitation affecting the score most is visual clarity. The same aggressive style that creates immediacy occasionally makes action harder to understand than it needs to be. Bourne's intelligence is most satisfying when the viewer can recognize the problem and appreciate the precision of his response. In some sequences, the fragmentation communicates impact and confusion more effectively than spatial logic. That weakness does not undermine the film's central design, but it prevents every action sequence from reaching the clarity of its dramatic ideas. The movie knows exactly what Bourne's choices mean, even when the camera does not always let us see every physical detail of how those choices unfold. The Bourne Supremacy will most reward viewers who enjoy serious espionage stories, restrained performances, institutional suspicion, and action shaped by character consequence. It is especially effective for viewers who prefer a protagonist whose abilities create moral complications rather than automatic heroism. People seeking relaxed entertainment, playful spy fantasy, extended character conversations, or cleanly framed action may find it severe. Its emotional expression is deliberately contained, and its visual language can be abrasive. Those are fair reasons not to connect with it, even though they emerge from choices that largely serve the film's purpose. It deserves focused viewing, ideally on the largest screen available with strong sound. Its impact depends on small visual reactions, environmental noise, and the physical sensation of movement. A distracted background viewing would flatten the investigation and reduce Bourne's observational intelligence to a sequence of sudden escapes. Its rewatch value is high. The conspiracy itself becomes less surprising, but the character behavior becomes more revealing. Abbott's attempts to control the investigation carry greater weight. Landy's changing pauses become easier to notice. Bourne's memories stop looking like isolated thriller clues and begin forming a path toward the Nesky family. Even Marie's limited screen time becomes more significant because the ending reveals how deeply her influence shapes the choices she does not live to see. The film also improves when watched as the middle movement of Bourne's larger identity struggle. The Bourne identity asks whether a man can reject the person he discovers himself to have been. The Bourne Supremacy asks what that rejection means when the consequences remain. It answers that a new identity cannot be built only through escape. It must also be built through the choices made when the old identity offers the fastest solution. That is why the ending remains controlled rather than triumphant. Bourne has not completed his recovery. He has not entered an ordinary life or resolved every missing part of David Webb. He has simply interrupted the pattern. Abbott expects him to kill and is exposed instead, Kirill expects the pursuit to end through destruction and is left alive. Irina expects to continue carrying a lie and is finally given the truth. Those choices do not erase Jason Bourne. They begin defining who David Webb might still become. What do you think truly changes Bourne in this film? Marie's influence, the return of his memories, or the moment he faces the human cost of his first assignment? And judged purely as a thriller, does the restless visual style deepen the experience for you, or does it make the action less effective? Share your interpretation in the comments, and subscribe if you value film analysis that looks beyond what happened to examine why it matters. Cinema Deep View, look closer, and the movie changes.